The morning mist clung to the streets of Millbrook, Pennsylvania, like a shroud on that cold November day in 1994. 12-year-old Tommy Brennan adjusted his altar server robes as he walked alongside his best friend, 14-year-old Marcus Rivera, toward St. Catherine's Catholic Church. The boys had been serving Mass together for nearly 2 years, their friendship forged through early morning services and shared responsibilities at the altar. Neither could have imagined that this ordinary Sunday would be their last walk through the familiar neighborhood streets. Before we continue with this haunting story of 2 young altar servers who vanished without a trace, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light, and we love connecting with viewers from around the world. Tommy's mother, Patricia Brennan, had watched from her kitchen window as the boys made their way down Maple Street, their white surplices bright against the gray morning. She noticed Tommy had forgotten his gloves again, his small hands shoved deep into his coat pockets against the November chill. The temperature had dropped to 32 degrees overnight, and frost covered the lawns like powdered sugar. Patricia made a mental note to remind him about the gloves when he returned home after the 10 o'clock service. Marcus carried the small wooden case containing the brass altar bells, a responsibility Father McKenna had entrusted to him just the month before. The bells, crafted in 1923 when the church was built, were used during the most sacred moments of the Mass. Marcus took this duty seriously, always ensuring the bells were polished and ready. His younger sister Elena had teased him that morning about his perfectionism, but Marcus simply smiled and carefully placed the bell case in his backpack alongside his prayer book. The 2 boys were inseparable despite their age difference. Tommy looked up to Marcus, who had helped him learn the Latin responses and taught him the proper way to light the altar candles. Marcus, in turn, appreciated Tommy's enthusiasm and genuine reverence during services. Father McKenna often commented that the boys worked together like they'd been serving for decades, their movements synchronized and purposeful. St. Catherine's Church stood at the end of Elm Street, its Gothic Revival architecture a testament to the faith of Millbrook's early Catholic settlers. The church had been the spiritual center of the community for over 70 years, witnessing countless baptisms, weddings, and funerals. On this particular Sunday, approximately 150 parishioners were expected for the 10 o'clock Mass, including both boys' families who had reserved their usual pews near the front. As Tommy and Marcus walked the familiar route, they passed the Hendersons' house where old Mrs. Henderson was retrieving her newspaper from the front porch. She waved to the boys, noting later to police that they seemed in good spirits, talking quietly and walking at their usual pace. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Tommy Brennan and Marcus Rivera. The route from Tommy's house on Maple Street to St. Catherine's Church was approximately 8 blocks, a walk the boys had made countless times. They typically followed Maple Street to Oak Avenue, then turned left onto Elm Street toward the church. The neighborhood was quiet and safe, with tree-lined streets and well-maintained homes where many families had lived for generations. Crime was virtually unheard of in this part of Millbrook, making what happened next all the more shocking. Father Patrick McKenna had arrived at the church at 8:30 that morning to prepare for the services. He unlocked the sacristy and began laying out the vestments and sacred vessels for Mass. By 9:45 he began to worry. Tommy and Marcus were always punctual, usually arriving by 9:30 to help with final preparations. Other altar servers had been late before, but never these 2 boys. They took their responsibilities too seriously. When 10 o'clock arrived and the boys still hadn't appeared, Father McKenna asked 2 adult parishioners to serve in their place. Patricia Brennan and Carmen Rivera, Marcus's mother, exchanged worried glances from their pews. After Mass, both mothers approached the priest, their concern evident. Father McKenna assured them that the boys had probably gotten distracted or lost track of time, but privately, he felt a growing unease. By 11:30, when neither boy had returned home, both families began calling neighbors and friends. Patricia Brennan contacted Mrs. Henderson, who confirmed seeing the boys around 9:15 that morning. Carmen Rivera called the few friends the boys might have visited, but no one had seen them. The Brennans and Riveras met at St. Catherine's to retrace the boys' likely path, hoping to find some clue about what had happened. Detective James Walsh of the Millbrook Police Department received the missing persons report at 12:45 that afternoon. A 20-year veteran of the force, Walsh had handled his share of missing children cases, but they usually involved runaways or custody disputes. This case felt different from the start. Two responsible religious boys from stable families don't simply vanish while walking to church. The initial search focused on the route between Tommy's house and St. Catherine's Church. Police officers, joined by growing numbers of volunteers from both families' extended networks and the parish community, methodically searched every yard, alley, and potential hiding spot. They checked abandoned buildings, construction sites, and the small creek that ran behind the elementary school. As daylight faded, the search expanded to include wooded areas on the outskirts of town. Detective Walsh interviewed Mrs. Henderson multiple times, trying to extract every detail from her brief encounter with the boys. She described them as walking normally, not appearing hurried or distressed. They hadn't been running, hadn't looked over their shoulders, and hadn't seemed to be following or being followed by anyone. Her description painted a picture of two boys on a routine Sunday morning, completely unaware that danger might be approaching. The Millbrook community rallied around the Brennan and Rivera families with unprecedented support. Neighbors organized search parties, local businesses donated food and supplies, and St. Catherine's Church became an unofficial command center for volunteer coordination. Father McKenna opened the parish hall for family members and searchers, providing a place for people to gather, share information, and support one another during the agonizing wait for news. As the first 24 hours passed without any trace of Tommy and Marcus, the investigation expanded beyond local resources. The Pennsylvania State Police were called in, bringing additional manpower and specialized search equipment. FBI agents from the Pittsburgh field office arrived to assess whether the disappearance might involve kidnapping or transportation across state lines. The case was quickly classified as a high-priority investigation involving endangered minors. Patricia Brennan struggled to maintain hope as each hour passed without word about her son. She found herself staring out the kitchen window where she'd last seen Tommy, replaying those final moments over and over. Her husband, Robert, a construction foreman, had taken leave from work to join the searches and coordinate with law enforcement. The couple leaned heavily on their faith and their church community, but the strain was evident in their faces and voices. Carmen Rivera, a single mother who worked as a nurse at Millbrook General Hospital, was devastated by Marcus's disappearance. She had raised Marcus and his younger sister Eleanor alone since her husband's death in a car accident 3 years earlier. Marcus had stepped up to help with household responsibilities and had been Elena's protector and role model. His disappearance left a void that seemed to echo through every room of their small house on Pine Street. The media attention began on Monday morning when the story appeared in the Millbrook Daily News. By Tuesday, television news crews from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia had arrived in town. The image of two young altar servers in their church robes became the face of the investigation, broadcast across Pennsylvania and eventually picked up by national news outlets. The publicity brought tips and offers of help from across the country, but also attracted attention that the small town wasn't prepared to handle. Detective Walsh found himself managing not only a complex investigation, but also intense media scrutiny and public pressure. Every decision was analyzed, every lead that didn't pan out was criticized, and the family's private grief was increasingly played out in public. Walsh had worked missing children cases before, but never under such intense spotlight. He knew that while media attention could be helpful in generating leads, it could also complicate the investigation and traumatize the families further. The investigation took its first major turn on Wednesday, when searchers found Tommy's prayer book in a storm drain approximately 6 blocks from the church, but not on the boy's usual route. The book was water-damaged, but still identifiable by Tommy's name, written in his careful handwriting on the inside cover. This discovery shifted the search focus to a different area of town and raised new questions about what might have happened that Sunday morning. The storm drain, where Tommy's prayer book was discovered, was located on Industrial Road, a street that ran behind several small manufacturing businesses and a trucking depot. This area was typically deserted on Sunday mornings, making it an unlikely place for the boys to have wandered voluntarily. Detective Walsh theorized that either the boys had been taken to this location against their will, or someone had disposed of evidence there after the fact. Forensic experts from the State Crime Lab examined the prayer book and the storm drain for additional evidence. They found no fingerprints other than Tommy's on the book, and no other personal items belonging to either boy in the immediate area. The book's condition suggested it had been in the drain for several days, but pinpointing exactly when it was placed there proved impossible. This single piece of evidence raised more questions than it answered. The discovery of Tommy's prayer book intensified the investigation's focus on the Industrial Road area. Police conducted extensive interviews with employees of the businesses located there, checking work schedules and security footage from the previous weekend. Most of the businesses were closed on Sundays, but investigators hoped someone might have been working overtime or making deliveries that morning. One lead emerged from Miller Trucking, the largest business on Industrial Road. The company's dispatcher, Janet Coleman, reported that one of their drivers, Ray Hutchinson, had called in sick on Sunday morning, but had been seen near the depot around the time the boys disappeared. Hutchinson, a 42-year-old long-haul driver with a previously clean record, suddenly became a person of interest in the investigation. When Detective Walsh and FBI agents interviewed Hutchinson at his apartment on Thursday evening, they found a man who seemed genuinely surprised by their questions. Hutchinson explained that he had indeed been sick on Sunday morning with a stomach bug, but had driven to the depot around 10 o'clock to pick up his paycheck, which he needed to deposit before the banks closed on Monday. His story seemed reasonable, and he willingly allowed police to search his truck and apartment. The search of Hutchinson's property yielded no evidence connecting him to the missing boys. His truck was clean, his apartment showed no signs of struggle or concealment, and his alibi was partially corroborated by a bank deposit slip, showing he had indeed cashed his paycheck on Monday morning. However, investigators noted that the timing of his visit to the depot coincided closely with the boy's disappearance, and they continued to monitor him as the investigation progressed. As the search entered its second week, the initial wave of volunteers began to dwindle, replaced by more systematic efforts coordinated by professional search and rescue teams. The Pennsylvania National Guard was called in to assist with searching larger areas of wilderness surrounding Millbrook. Helicopters with thermal imaging equipment flew grid patterns over the countryside, while ground teams with search dogs combed through dense forests and abandoned properties. The emotional toll on both families was becoming increasingly evident. Patricia and Robert Brennan had barely slept since their son's disappearance, surviving on coffee and the determination to find Tommy. Their house had become a gathering place for extended family members who had traveled from across Pennsylvania to help with the search efforts. The constant activity provided some distraction from their anguish, but the underlying fear for Tommy's safety grew stronger with each passing day. Carmen Rivera struggled to maintain normalcy for her daughter Elena while dealing with her own overwhelming grief and worry about Marcus. Elena, only 10 years old, didn't fully understand why her brother hadn't come home, and Carmen found herself trying to explain the inexplicable while maintaining hope she wasn't sure she felt. The Rivera house, usually filled with Marcus's laughter and music, had become unnaturally quiet and tense. Father McKenna found himself serving not only as a spiritual counselor, but as a coordinator for the massive volunteer effort centered at St. Catherine's Church. The parish hall had been converted into a command center with maps, phone banks, and supply stations. The priest conducted special prayer services every evening, drawing hundreds of community members who sought comfort and wanted to demonstrate their support for the missing boys and their families. The investigation expanded to include a thorough examination of both boys' backgrounds and activities. Detective Walsh interviewed their teachers, classmates, and coaches, looking for any indication that they might have been targeted or might have had reasons to disappear voluntarily. Both boys were described consistently as responsible, well-liked students with no history of behavioral problems or conflicts that might explain their disappearance. Teachers at Millbrook Middle School, where both boys attended, painted a picture of two students who were academically solid and socially well-adjusted. Tommy was described as quiet but friendly, with a talent for mathematics and a love of reading. Marcus was more outgoing, involved in the school's soccer team, and known for helping younger students with their studies. Neither boy had shown any signs of distress or unusual behavior in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. The boys' friendship was noted by everyone who knew them as being particularly close, despite their age difference. They had met when Tommy began serving as an altar boy, and Marcus was assigned to mentor him. Their shared faith and commitment to their church duties had forged a bond that extended beyond their religious activities. They often studied together, played basketball at the community center, and had even talked about attending the same high school when Tommy reached 9th grade. On November 20th, exactly 2 weeks after the boys' disappearance, the investigation received its second major break. A maintenance worker cleaning out a different storm drain system on the opposite side of town discovered Marcus's backpack, still containing the wooden case with the brass altar bells. Like Tommy's prayer book, the backpack was water-damaged but clearly identifiable. The bells themselves were tarnished but intact, their distinctive engravings still visible despite their time in the drainage system. The discovery of Marcus's backpack in a location even further from the boys' intended route suggested a deliberate pattern of evidence disposal. Detective Walsh now had 2 pieces of evidence found in storm drains on opposite sides of Millbrook, neither near the route the boys should have taken to church. This pattern indicated that whoever was responsible for the boys' disappearance had intimate knowledge of the town's drainage system and had used it to dispose of evidence systematically. Crime scene technicians processed the second storm drain location with the same thoroughness as the first, hoping to find additional clues or forensic evidence. The backpack yielded Marcus's fingerprints and some fabric fibers that didn't match his clothing from that morning, but no clear indicators of what had happened to him or Tommy. The brass bells, examined carefully by experts, showed no signs of damage beyond normal tarnishing from exposure to moisture. The discovery of the altar bells had particular significance for the investigation and the community. These bells had been blessed by 3 different priests over the decades and were considered sacred objects by the parishioners of St. Catherine's. Their recovery brought some small measure of comfort to the congregation, but also served as a stark reminder of the 2 boys who remained missing. Father McKenna held a special blessing service for the recovered bells, praying for the safe return of Tommy and Marcus. The investigation's focus shifted to analyzing the pattern of evidence disposal and trying to identify someone with the knowledge and opportunity to place items in storm drains across town. City workers, utility employees, and anyone with access to drainage system maps became potential suspects or witnesses. Detective Walsh coordinated with city engineers to understand the drainage system's layout and identify other locations where evidence might have been disposed of. As November turned to December, the investigation had consumed countless hours of police work and FBI resources, but the boys remained missing. The initial flood of tips and leads had slowed to a trickle, and many of the most promising avenues had been exhausted without results. The case began to take on the characteristics of a long-term investigation, with detectives knowing they might be working it for months or even years to come. The approaching Christmas season brought additional anguish to both families. Patricia Brennan couldn't bring herself to put up the family's usual decorations, while Carmen Rivera struggled with Elena's questions about whether Marcus would be home for Christmas. Both families participated in community vigils and prayer services, drawing strength from their faith and the continued support of their neighbors. But the holiday preparations that should have brought joy instead served as painful reminders of their loss. The case began to attract attention from amateur investigators and true crime enthusiasts, some of whom contacted the families with theories and potential leads. While most of these contacts were well-intentioned, they added to the emotional burden on the Brennans and Riveras, who found themselves explaining the same details repeatedly to strangers who claimed they might be able to help solve the case. Detective Walsh worked with FBI behavioral analysts to develop a profile of the person or persons responsible for the boy's disappearance. The careful disposal of evidence in multiple locations suggested someone organized and methodical, likely familiar with the local area. The targeting of 2 altar servers might indicate someone with connections to the Catholic Church or someone who had observed the boy's routine over time. However, the profile remained frustratingly general, applicable to dozens of potential suspects in the Millbrook area. By the end of December 1994, the active search phase of the investigation had largely concluded. While the case remained open and active, the day-to-day search efforts had been suspended as winter weather made outdoor searching increasingly difficult and dangerous. The families faced the grim reality that Tommy and Marcus might not be found alive, though they refused to give up hope entirely. The new year brought a shift in investigative strategy. Rather than continuing massive search efforts, Detective Walsh and the FBI focused on following up on tips, re-interviewing witnesses, and looking for connections they might have missed in the initial investigation. They also began preparing for the possibility that the case might go cold, ensuring that all evidence was properly preserved and that the investigation file was organized for future review. The impact on Millbrook's community was profound and lasting. Parents became more protective of their children. Church attendance increased as people sought comfort in faith, and the town's sense of innocence was permanently altered. The disappearance of Tommy Brennan and Marcus Rivera became a defining moment for Millbrook, referenced in conversations for years to come, and serving as a reminder that tragedy could strike even the safest communities. Spring of 1995 brought renewed search efforts as snow melted and previously inaccessible areas became searchable again. Volunteer groups organized systematic searches of wooded areas, abandoned buildings, and rural properties surrounding Millbrook. The Pennsylvania State Police coordinated these efforts, providing professional oversight and ensuring that any discoveries would be properly processed as evidence. Despite the renewed search efforts, no additional evidence was found. The case began to exhibit the characteristics that Detective Walsh had seen in other long-term missing persons investigations: decreasing media attention, fewer volunteer searches, and the gradual shift from active searching to waiting for new information or evidence to emerge. The families struggled with this transition, feeling that reduced search activity somehow meant people were giving up on finding Tommy and Marcus. The first anniversary of the boys' disappearance was marked by a memorial service at St. Catherine's Church. Hundreds of community members attended, demonstrating that Millbrook had not forgotten Tommy Brennan and Marcus Rivera. Father McKenna delivered a homily about faith in the face of uncertainty, while both families spoke about their continued hope and their gratitude for the community's support. The service provided some comfort, but also underscored the painful reality that an entire year had passed without answers. Detective Walsh, now promoted to sergeant, continued working the case even as new investigations demanded his attention. He had developed a personal investment in finding the boys and couldn't accept the possibility that their disappearance might never be solved. He periodically reviewed the case file, re-interviewed key witnesses, and followed up on any new tips or leads that emerged. His dedication became legendary within the department and provided some reassurance to the families that their sons had not been forgotten by law enforcement. The case attracted periodic attention from television programs focused on unsolved mysteries and missing persons cases. These features brought renewed public interest and sometimes generated new tips, but none led to breakthrough discoveries. The Brennan and Rivera families participated in these programs despite the emotional difficulty, hoping that national exposure might reach someone with crucial information about their son's fate. As the years passed, both families struggled with the unique challenges of ambiguous loss, grief without closure, hope without resolution. Patricia and Robert Brennan eventually divorced, unable to navigate their grief together, though both remained committed to finding Tommy. Carmen Rivera threw herself into nursing and raising Elena, but never stopped believing that Marcus might somehow return home. Both families kept the boys' rooms exactly as they had been on November 6, 1994, unable to accept that their sons might never come back. The investigation officially transitioned to cold case status in 1998, though it was never formally closed. Detective Walsh, by then approaching retirement, passed the case files to Detective Lisa Martinez, a younger investigator who brought fresh eyes and new techniques to the investigation. Martinez reviewed every piece of evidence, re-interviewed witnesses whose memories might have improved over time, and applied emerging forensic technologies to physical evidence collected during the initial investigation. The dawn of the Internet age brought new possibilities for the investigation. Detective Martinez created digital files of the case information and used early online databases to search for similar cases or patterns in other jurisdictions. She also worked with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to ensure that Tommy and Marcus's information was widely distributed through emerging digital channels. These efforts expanded the investigation's reach, but didn't produce immediate results. By the 10th anniversary in 2004, the case had become part of Millbrook's local history and folklore. New residents learned about the missing altar servers from longtime neighbors, and the story was passed down through families like a cautionary tale. St. Catherine's Church installed a memorial plaque for Tommy and Marcus, acknowledging their service and keeping their memory alive within the parish community. The plaque served as a daily reminder to parishioners to continue praying for the boys' return and for comfort for their families. Elena Rivera, now 20 years old and a nursing student like her mother, had grown up in the shadow of her brother's disappearance. She had no clear memories of Marcus, but his absence had shaped her entire life. Carmen had told her countless stories about her big brother, creating a relationship with someone Elena had never really known, but felt connected to through family narratives and community memories. The case experienced a brief resurgence of attention in 2009 when construction workers renovating an old warehouse on Industrial Road discovered a hidden room that hadn't been accessed in decades. Detective Martinez thoroughly investigated the space, hoping it might contain evidence related to the boys' disappearance, but found only old manufacturing equipment and storage materials. The discovery generated media coverage and renewed public interest. but ultimately provided no new leads. Patricia Brennan, now living alone after her divorce and her ex-husband's move to another state, had become an advocate for families of missing children. She worked with support groups and occasionally spoke at conferences about the long-term impact of ambiguous loss. Her advocacy work provided some sense of purpose and helped her process her own grief, though she never stopped hoping for news about Tommy. She maintained contact with Detective Martinez and remained ready to assist with the investigation at any time. Carmen Rivera had remarried in 2008 to a fellow nurse who understood and respected her continuing grief for Marcus. Her new husband, David Thompson, had been supportive of her need to keep Marcus's memory alive and had even helped organize anniversary memorial services. Elena had accepted David as a stepfather figure, though she always made clear that Marcus remained her real brother, regardless of his physical absence. Detective Martinez retired in 2015, passing the case to Detective Kevin O'Brien, who brought experience with cold cases and familiarity with advanced forensic techniques. O'Brien immediately began reviewing the physical evidence with an eye toward DNA testing and other forensic methods that hadn't been available in 1994. He also started using social media and online platforms to generate new interest in the case and potentially reach witnesses who might not have come forward previously. The 25th anniversary in 2019 was marked by a comprehensive review of the case conducted by the Pennsylvania State Police Cold Case Unit. Using modern investigative techniques and fresh perspectives, investigators re-examined every piece of evidence and every witness statement. They applied geographic profiling, advanced DNA analysis, and digital reconstruction methods to the existing evidence, hoping to identify new avenues for investigation. This review process led to the re-examination of the brass altar bells, which had been returned to St. Catherine's Church and were still used during Mass. Advanced forensic techniques revealed previously undetected trace evidence on the bells, microscopic fibers and chemical residues that hadn't been identifiable with 1990s technology. These traces were analyzed and compared against databases of materials and substances, potentially providing new leads about where the bells had been during the boy's disappearance. The forensic analysis of the altar bells revealed traces of industrial lubricants and metal shavings, consistent with materials used in automotive repair shops. This discovery prompted investigators to re-examine businesses and individuals in Millbrook who had been involved in automotive work during the 1990s. They compiled lists of auto repair shops, mechanics, and even hobbyists who might have had access to similar materials and began systematically investigating these connections. One name that emerged during this review was Frank Kowalski, who had operated a small auto repair shop on Industrial Road from 1990 to 1997. Kowalski had been briefly questioned during the original investigation, but hadn't been considered a serious suspect. The new forensic evidence, combined with his proximity to where evidence had been found, prompted investigators to take a closer look at his background and activities during the time of the boy's disappearance. Research into Kowalski's background revealed a more complex picture than had been apparent in 1994. He had previous arrests for theft and fraud in other states, information that hadn't been readily available to investigators in the pre-internet era. More significantly, he had abruptly closed his repair shop and left Millbrook in early 1997, telling neighbors he was moving to Florida to care for a sick relative. Attempts to locate him in Florida had been unsuccessful, and his current whereabouts were unknown. Detective O'Brien worked with federal authorities to locate Frank Kowalski, now 73 years old and living in a retirement community in Arizona under a slightly different name. When approached by investigators, Kowalski initially denied any knowledge of the missing altar servers, but became increasingly nervous and evasive when questioned about his activities on November 6, 1994. His responses contained inconsistencies and contradictions that raised additional suspicions about his involvement. The investigation into Kowalski revealed that he had left Pennsylvania much more abruptly than he had claimed, abandoning his repair shop lease and leaving behind significant debts and equipment. Neighbors recalled that he had seemed anxious and preoccupied in the months following the boy's disappearance, often working late into the night and becoming increasingly isolated from the community. These behavioral changes, viewed in hindsight, suggested someone dealing with significant stress or guilt. When confronted with the forensic evidence linking his former repair shop to the altar bells, Kowalski requested an attorney and refused to answer further questions. However, investigators had gathered sufficient evidence to obtain search warrants for his current residence and any storage units or properties he might have access to. The search revealed additional evidence, including newspaper clippings about the boy's disappearance that he had kept for nearly 3 decades. The discovery of Kowalski's collection of newspaper articles about Tommy and Marcus's disappearance was significant evidence of his ongoing interest in the case. The clippings were carefully preserved and organized, suggesting an obsessive attention to the investigation's progress over the years. This behavior was consistent with psychological profiles of perpetrators who maintain involvement in cases they're responsible for, often following media coverage and even inserting themselves into investigations. Further investigation revealed that Kowalski had approached several families in the Millbrook area during the 1990s, offering to help search for the boys or providing unsolicited theories about what might have happened to them. This behavior, which had seemed helpful at the time, was now viewed as potentially suspicious. Several witnesses recalled that Kowalski had seemed particularly knowledgeable about the boys' routines and the locations where evidence had been found. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators discovered a storage unit that Kowalski had rented in Pennsylvania and continued paying for, even after moving to Arizona. Inside the unit, buried beneath decades of accumulated possessions, investigators found Tommy's winter coat and Marcus's church shoes, items that had never been found despite extensive searches of the Millbrook area. The clothing was carefully packaged and showed signs of having been preserved deliberately, suggesting that Kowalski had kept them as trophies or mementos. DNA evidence from the recovered clothing definitively linked it to both boys and also contained traces of DNA that matched Frank Kowalski. This physical evidence, combined with his suspicious behavior, his proximity to the crime scene, and his documented interest in the case over the decades, provided the foundation for criminal charges. After 32 years, the investigation finally had a viable suspect and credible evidence of his involvement in the boy's disappearance. Kowalski was arrested in Arizona on charges related to the kidnapping and murder of Tommy Brennan and Marcus Rivera. His arrest made national news, bringing renewed attention to a case that had remained in the public consciousness in Millbrook but had been largely forgotten elsewhere. The arrest provided some measure of closure for the families and the community, though many questions remained unanswered about exactly what had happened to the boys and where their remains might be located. Patricia Brennan, now 68 years old, received the news of Kowalski's arrest with a mixture of relief and anguish. After 32 years of uncertainty, she finally had answers about who was responsible for Tommy's disappearance, but she still didn't know where her son was or exactly what had happened to him. The arrest validated her decades of believing that Tommy and Marcus had been taken by someone, but it also confirmed her worst fears about their fate. Carmen Rivera Thompson and her daughter Eleanor were together when they learned of the arrest. Elena, now 36 and a mother herself, had lived her entire adult life in the shadow of her brother's disappearance. The news brought a complex mix of emotions: relief that someone was finally being held accountable, anger about the decades of suffering her family had endured, and sadness that Marcus would never truly come home. The legal proceedings began with Kowalski's extradition to Pennsylvania to face charges. His defense attorney argued that the evidence was circumstantial and that his client's advanced age and poor health made him an unlikely perpetrator of such crimes. However, prosecutors felt confident that the combination of physical evidence, behavioral evidence, and witness testimony would be sufficient to secure a conviction. During pre-trial proceedings, investigators continued pressing Kowalski to reveal the location of Tommy and Marcus's remains. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, he maintained his innocence and refused to provide any information about what had happened to the boys or where they might be found. This refusal to cooperate meant that the families would have to endure a trial without the closure of recovering their sons' bodies. The trial, scheduled for the fall of 2025, promised to be a media sensation and a long-awaited reckoning for the Millbrook community. Prosecutors prepared to present evidence spanning 3 decades, while defense attorneys sought to poke holes in an investigation that had relied heavily on forensic advances that didn't exist when the crime was committed. The case would test the limits of how old evidence could be used to prosecute crimes committed in an earlier technological era. As the legal process moved forward, both families began the difficult work of processing emotions they had carried for over 3 decades. Support groups for families of missing children provided resources and counseling to help them navigate this new phase of their grief journey. The arrest didn't bring Tommy and Marcus back, but it did provide answers that allowed the families to begin a different kind of healing process. The brass altar bells, now evidence in a criminal case, were no longer used during Mass at St. Catherine's Church. Father McKenna, now in his 80s and retired, reflected on how the bells had remained silent for so many years, their voices stilled by the tragedy that had taken 2 young servants of the church. The bells had become symbols of loss and hope, their eventual recovery, providing the key evidence that led to solving the case that had haunted Millbrook for more than 3 decades. The story of Tommy Brennan and Marcus Rivera serves as a reminder that even the coldest cases can eventually find resolution through persistence, advancing technology, and the refusal of families and communities to forget. Their disappearance changed Millbrook forever, but their memory also inspired decades of community solidarity and demonstrated the power of faith and determination in the face of seemingly insurmountable tragedy. The brass altar bells, once symbols of sacred service, had become instruments of justice, their silent testimony finally speaking truth after 32 years of mystery.